Sudan's no stranger to crisis and is now in the grip of a flooding emergency. On top of displacement and despair, there is the threat of diseases during a pandemic. How much is climate change to blame? And how can the country respond? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hashem Ahelbarra. In Sudan, millions rely on the Nile River for food, for agriculture and for industry. But the lifeblood of many has now pushed parts of the country into crisis. Thousands have been forced from their homes in the worst floods in a century. Many villages on the Nile's banks are devastated and have been abandoned. Across the country, at least 100 people have died. Even in the capital, Khartoum, people are trying to continue their lives while waist-deep in water. And now stagnant waters are creating a wave of illnesses, stretching medical services already struggling with the pandemic. Hiba Morgan has more.
More than 500,000 people have been affected by the heavy floods, which Sudanese officials say is the worst in more than a century. Now, over the past few days, waters from the Nile River have been receding, but it's also revealing with it many shortcomings and weaknesses in the government and its response. The first being the drainage system in the country. Now, people in areas affected say they can see waters from the river and from the sewage system mingling together, and medics in areas affected say that's resulting in a rise in the number of cases of bilharzia, a parasitic disease that is born from mostly drinking unclean water. They're also saying that they're seeing a rise in the number of watery diarrhea, and there are concerns that with more stagnant water and more rains in the coming days, there will be a rise in the number of cases of cholera and malaria. This is on top of a health infrastructure that has already been weak prior to the emergency of the floods. Now, the other weakness these floods have revealed is the economic weakness of the country. Over the past 10 days, the Sudanese pound has lost more than 40% of its value, which led the Sudanese government to declare a state of emergency, an economic state of emergency on Thursday evening. They say that anybody caught meddling with the Sudanese economy and convicted will face up to 10 years in prison. But people in areas affected say the biggest weakness that these floods have revealed is the weakness in the government response. They say many of them are living out in the open, more than 100,000 in Khartoum alone. They're saying that they're in desperate need of shelter, in desperate need of health care and proper medication and sanitation. But more than that, they're in desperate need of attention by the government. They say that if this is how the government is responding right now, how will the government respond in the coming days, with forecasts saying more rains are to come in the future. Reporting from Khartoum, Hiba Morgan for Inside Story.
Here are our guests in Khartoum. Nisreen, ElSaim, chair of the UN Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change. Joining us in Doha is Waleed Madibo, founder and president of Sudan Policy Forum. And from Paris is Francois Gemenne. He's professor of environmental geopolitics and migration dynamics at the Paris Institute of Political Studies. Thank you to all of you. Nisreen, Sudan is a country that has gone many times through different cycles of floods and drought. Is there a general sentiment among the political establishment and the people that they see something linked to climate change and therefore this is the way we should move forward in the near future?
Hi, everyone. Yes, it is very much linked to the climate change. Although we had a big journey and a long way to cross in order to make politicians and government officials in different districts to understand how climate change is impacting and affecting different way of lives within Sudan and within their areas of work. Yes, climate change is not only affecting Sudan in the natural disasters, but it's also affecting Sudan in other ways. It's the root causes for a lot of conflicts. it's also affecting the economical situation of the country, because we are 100% dependent on our natural resources. More than 70% is people depending on water and food directly from the nature. So I think the floods is only making things worse and only showing how much climate change can impact the lives and every way of the Sudanese people's life, especially the infrastructure.
Waleed, natural disasters sometimes are beyond the capacity of nations to handle on their own. But don't you think that the government or that Sudan has failed to put forth a clear plan of action to deal with crises like this one?
As you correctly put it, these natural disasters expose the political and administrative systems, but as characteristically dysfunctional as they were functioning till the mid-80s. And it's due to the desertification and civil wars, millions of people migrated to the big cities, mainly Khartoum, whose infrastructure is very weak. And I need to remind the viewers that the infrastructure of Khartoum was provided by the British in 1954, and it was designed only to withstand the pressure of 250,000 human beings. Now Khartoum has about 12 million human beings. 12 million during the daytime, and only 12. People who come from the periphery. I wish to look upon this as a governance crisis, because if we go back to 2010, Haiti was hit by an earthquake of 7.5 Richter's magnitude, leaving thousands dead, while Chile was hit in the same year by an earthquake of a magnitude of 8.8 Richter's, and it left about 250,000 human beings dead. And this tells you the difference, that it's a governance crisis. In the case of Chile, they had a governance committee that worked at identification of common goals, synchronization of resources, and establishment of common language. We lack this in the case of Sudan.
Okay, I see your point. Francois, experts have been warning for years about the fact that Sudan was undergoing environmental changes, increases in temperature, floods, rainfall variability, and drought, and so on and so forth. It seems that these warnings were somehow overshadowed by Sudan's own political problems.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it is fair to say that Sudan is one of the most vulnerable countries to the impacts of climate change, be it droughts or floods, and actually both droughts and floods reinforce each other. It is because there have been droughts that we know have floods, because the soil is no longer able to absorb the rainfall. And the problem indeed is that the adaptation capacities of Sudan have been kind of hindered by the political tensions and the conflicts that have been going on in the country for the last few years. And it needs to be said that countries that undergo conflict and violence are also more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, because their adaptation capacities are not what they should be or what they could be. So this is indeed a challenge for Sudan, and we need to understand that the political crisis, the environmental crisis, and the economic hardship all go hand in hand. And we're in the face of a compounded disaster that has already today displaced more than 500,000 people. And if durable solutions, if shelters are not found for these people, then it is likely that they will impose an additional demographic pressure on other areas, which could in turn transform into tensions and economic hardship.
Nisreen, if yourself and all the activists in the country, if you are to talk to the government now about the fact that Sudan is a Nile River nation where many populous cities are on the banks of the river, and that therefore there needs to be a new planning strategy of the country to be able to cope with the ramifications of disasters like this particular one. Do you think that this could easily become a top priority for a government which is dealing with a series of other problems?
I think the correct question will be, does the government have the capacity to do such a modification or not? As my colleagues earlier said, we have more than 1 million persons living by the Nile. Does the government have the capacity to move all of these from the barriers of the Nile and then relocate them in somewhere else? This is a huge question. During this hardness of the economical situation that Sudan is facing for the last 5 or 6 years after the separation of South Sudan. It's a matter of, does the current government have the capacity, not only financial, but also in the terms of the efficiency of the government institutions, indicators, do they have the capacity to actually do such a big project? And also, how much help or support from the international community will this government receive in order to do such a movement? It's not something simple or small. It's a huge change, a huge step. So the government cannot even cannot even try to promise people with such a thing without securing the enough resources in order to start planning for such a process. It's not an easy job. It's not an easy task to do, and it's very important to always mention that Sudan was not even until now. It's not part of the global emitters countries. Yet it suffers from climate change more than any other country.
Okay.
So how the government is going to explain this to the people? It's not our fault, yet we are suffering from that.
Waleed, Sudan obviously is facing extraordinary challenges ahead. During times of drought, many parts of the country become uninhabitable because obviously there is absolutely no water. Now we're seeing the opposite of that. Huge parts of the country uninhabitable because of the flood. It gives you the impression that from now onwards, the Sudanese government and the people have to think about all the other alternatives in the near future when there is drought and when there is flood.
Yeah, the priority for the Sudanese government is to design and work at implementing a national development strategy. See, none of the rulers of Sudan in the last 64 years have thought seriously about designing a national development strategy. But we can't compare the last 30 years with the years before. In the last 30 years, this regime, the regime that was removed by this great revolution, it aimed and worked at totally debilitating the local governance system. It totally destroyed the bureaucracy. There used to be something called it's equivalent to the Corps of Engineers, and it used to cooperate with the local governance administrators to at least help people build their residence in an environmentally sustainable area. The University of Khartoum used to receive funds that would help develop materials that are environmentally friendly and economically feasible for the population. Now, the governance, it's a governance issue, and Luke has to, being an educated person himself and somebody who is ought to perceive science as a government.
Okay.
We can't just go around this not thinking that planning, not believing in the utility of planning. There are going to be some very serious problems with the Millennium Dam, because and this is something that
we will talk about that later.
Rather than we need to look retrospectively as well as prospectively.
Okay, Francois, when you look at the images coming out from Sudan, you see the massive impact of the floods to the point where you would just easily say that this is a country that needs hundreds of millions of dollars in the coming years to be able to cope with the impact of the floods. How can the country handle the situation when it seems like there's an international donor's apathy when it comes to Sudan?
Yes, indeed. I think that in many ways Sudan suffers from a bad reputation due to the fact that it was ruled for years by Omar al-Bashir, who was himself being sued for crime against humanity and war crimes. And therefore, because of the former political regime in Sudan, I think that there is some kind of general apathy when it comes to international humanitarian assistance. And I think that it's extremely important that the international community mobilizes itself and provides not only humanitarian assistance to Sudan, but also long-term funding for adaptation so that Sudan can really beef up its adaptation capacities, because these floods will happen again in the future, and future droughts will also happen again. And we know that more people will get displaced, and Sudan is already one of the main countries of origin of international migrants, including asylum seekers, so that there is a real regional but also international concern that we should have. And on that line, I would also like to commend the efforts that have been made recently by countries of Eastern Africa to develop a protocol for free movement in the region of the Horn of Africa. I think that this is an extremely important protocol that should help and facilitate the movement of people when they are affected by such disasters. And there is also the Kampala Convention, which is a regional convention that should be protecting people displaced by disasters. So regionally, there are instruments that exist. Now they need to be used.
Nisreen, the level of the Nile River is expected to further increase in the coming days, raising many concerns about a protracted flood in the country, to the point where hundreds of thousands of people are moving highlands. Do you expect to see more migration towards neighboring country if the situation continues as it is?
I don't think it will be toward neighboring countries. I think it will be internal displacement. Because, for example, maybe if you are talking about in the long run and on the long way, maybe in 5 or 10 years, yes, we might see a lot of migration to our neighboring countries. But I think currently during this flood period, most of the displacement is towards a drier area within Sudan itself. I've been to many camps, small camps for affected areas, and they are living in tents, and the numbers are very high. They don't have access to enough clean water access or latrines. So I think we will have a huge, as you mentioned earlier, environmental and health issues. I think that we have a long run to go, and I am fear that a lot of conflicts will appear because of this displacement. We already have a shortage in a lot of natural resources, and with the movement of people, they might be ending up in a place that actually owned by others, which will always be a reason or a trigger for another conflict. So I'm not sure if the conflicts we're going to stop soon in Sudan, not because of the government or the regime or the politics, but because of the natural resources.
Waleed, you spoke earlier about the row over the Renaissance Dam built in Ethiopia, and saying that this should be solved for all the countries, including Sudan, to have a clear policy about how to move forward. But don't you think that this flood could be an opportunity for Sudan, for Egypt, for Ethiopia, and for all the Nile Basin countries to work out a new platform like the one they had before 2010, which was the early warning to mitigate the risk of any floods?
Absolutely. I think the answer in this case, the answer for Sudan is not big dams. The answer for Sudan is small dams. The bridge back at the days of the when Sudan was colonized, they wrote a report as they were leaving, and they said that Sudan needs two things. It needs a good managerial system, and it's small dams. With small dams, we could have avoided a lot of disasters. But now with Ethiopia building a dam that has a storage capacity of 74 billion cubic meters, Sudan risks experiencing a flood 120 times what we are seeing now. God forbid, should this millennium dam gets destroyed. And most of the scholars who were interviewed, the scientific papers that I read and others commented about, it says that the dam can at most sustain this water pressure for like 5 years. So I think we ought to take things seriously. The Ethiopians, as of yet, couldn't find one single company that would provide them insurance for their dam.
Okay.
They are still very reluctant, and they totally refuse to provide the technical report or to cooperate with Sudan and Egypt in this whole issue.
Francois, this is a country
but I think.
Yeah,
but I just want to throw one point.
Very briefly, if you don't mind,
for
please.
Sudan issue is not money. Money is not is definitely important, but more importantly, we need a vision. The Prime Minister should be able to utilize human resources at his disposal. The Sudanese people are very educated, and he should take advantage of that.
Francois, this is a country that has its own domestic issues, pervasive corruption, mismanagement of public funds, long era of autocracy. There is this government that needs to end the transition to democracy and pave the way for a vibrant, democratic, elected government in the country. Until then, the international community does not seem to be willing to commit more cash to help Sudan. Don't you think that this could pave the way for the Sudanese government to turn to regional allies, to revive the Nile Basin initiative, to try to come together and see how they can sort out all these problems, and particularly on top of the agenda is how to deal with climate change?
I agree that many of the solutions against climate change, be they related to mitigation, that is the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, or adaptation to the impacts of climate change, are to be found at the regional level. Of course, international solidarity is important, but I feel that we're not using enough the regional level, and yet there are many solutions that can be found on the regional level. And as I said, this is particularly the case in Eastern Africa, where countries have also a long history of cooperation, of regional institutions. And this is a topic, the topic of climate change and displacement, that is at the very core of the business of regional organizations in Eastern Africa. So I very much hope that this crisis can also be an opportunity for Sudan to work more strongly with its regional partners, and that we can see a kind of real cooperation and governance on the regional level for this.
Nisreen, in less than a minute, if you don't mind, is it the right time for you and for the many activists on climate change to raise awareness among the Sudanese people about the need to build a climate resilient country instead of being bogged down in regional and local conflicts that have depleted the economy of the country and have delayed all the efforts to bring about a strong, vibrant, democratic Sudan?
Yes, absolutely. It's very important. And it's also very important to always acknowledge that Sudan was not part of the emissions that caused climate change. And it's also very important to deliver that there's a concept called climate justice. And climate justice is always about being less emitters and less affected, and always being able to adapt and always have the capability and the capacity to adapt to the climate change. And it's also very important to raise the issue of loss and damage, because it's very important within the negotiations and the climate change talk along the year. And it's an issue that was not solved until now, but it's really a key for us and for a lot of developing countries to talk about loss and damage.
Nisreen, ElSaim, Waleed, Madibo, Francois Gemenne, we have to leave it there, unfortunately, but I really appreciate your insight and looking forward to talking to you in the near future about Sudan, climate change and floods and how to move forward. Thank you. Thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story.